Asanga Abeyagoonasekera, and dear participants, very good afternoon. Welcome to nice webinar on Great Power Rivalry in Sri Lanka. Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement is an independent, apolitical, and non-partisan think tank which believes in freedom, democracy, and a world free from conflict. We envision a world where sources of insecurity are identified and understood, conflicts are prevented or resolved, and peace is advocated. Neighborhood Studies is one of our major research centers here at NICE, and we do not limit ourselves to our immediate and big neighbor, China and India, but also focus on Bangladesh, Bhutan, Afghanistan, Maldives, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka. We have been organizing at least one webinar on Sri Lanka with Sri Lankan scholars every month, and we wish to continue with that. To talk on today's interesting topic, we have Mr. Asanga Abeyagoonasekera. Asanga is Founder Director General of Institute of National Security Studies Sri Lanka. We'd like to welcome Asanga to our webinar. Asanga is an international security and geopolitics analyst. He is visiting professor for Geopolitics and Global Leadership, NKU USA, visiting lecturer for international security, Colombo University, Sri Lanka, and international political economy, University of London, Royal Institute Colombo. Asanga has authored 2 books, Sri Lanka at Crossroads, published by World Scientific Singapore, and Towards a Better World Order, which was published in 2015. He publishes regularly at different think tanks, journals, and newspapers. He also participates regularly at international forums such as World Economic Forum, Manama Dialogue, IISS Shangri-la Dialogue, and others. He has almost 2 decades of experience in the government sector in Sri Lanka, serving several administrations in advisory positions to working at the government think tank for foreign policy and defense. He is the founding Director General of National Security Think Tank under the Ministry of Defense, INSSSL. Before this, he also served as the Executive Director at the Kadir Gamar Institute and Director General of Diplomatic Training Institute. He served as an advisor to Ministry of External Affairs of Sri Lanka, Professor G.L Peiris. He was educated in United States, Harvard Kennedy School and Jackson Institute of Global Affairs at Yale University, Liquan School of Public Policy in Singapore, and ISB India, and Western Australia University. He is an alumnus of the US State Department, IVLP, and National Defense University, Washington, and IPCSS, Hawaii. He is a founder curator of Global Shapers Colombo Hub and Global Dignity Country Chair of Sri Lanka. Asanga is a node chair of Millennium Project Foresight inside Global Think Tank, Washington DC. He is a senior advisor and member of the Academic Advisory Committee of Non-Traditional Security and Peaceful Development Studies, NTS-PD, and Zhejiang University, China. Asanga, you can make your initial remarks in 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll open the floor for discussion. Asanga, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Pramod, and I would like to thank NIICP for the invitation. I think it's this topic on the great power rivalry in Sri Lanka. I think it's timely that we discuss this, and also I'm looking forward to listen to some of the ideas from and also share my thoughts. So I have a presentation. So let me share that with you. In a second. I think it's visible now, I believe.
Yes, visible.
Yeah, so some of the points I would discuss this 30 minutes, basically Sri Lanka's geography, the importance, why Sri Lanka is so important in the Indian Ocean and to many powers. The 2 theories I will discuss, and the triple sphere of influence to the island, the great power rivalry, which is brewing in the vicinity, as well as effects that we can feel from the island, which is US, China, and China-India. And the Chinese and the US and the Indian spheres of influence in Sri Lanka will be discussed in the presentation. I will sort of discuss about the Sri Lankan foreign policy and then about the domestic political landscape. A week ago, the new government of Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa came to office, as well as the new cabinet now has taken the first decision, which is the amendment to the constitution. And I will also discuss about the four challenges for the Rajapaksa regime, which they will sort of have to face. Most of my writings, as well as what I present here, are from first-hand experience that I've sort of compiled. My last book was Sri Lanka at Crossroads, where I discussed about the significant Chinese sphere of influence in the island, and also the Western sphere of influence that's in the country, and also the closest neighbor, Indian sphere. So the triple sphere I have discussed in 2018. My next book, which is coming out in November, basically focus much more on the Chinese sphere of influence. On the left, this is a visit to the USS Stennis, where near the Andaman Islands, where I visited the aircraft carrier, and basically I had an opportunity to discuss on some of the strategies that the US has in this basically the ocean sphere surrounding the Sri Lanka. The middle is myself in Kazakhstan. Basically, when Sri Lanka took the membership of the TICA, the initiative, became a full member. And most of these places I visited, from Latin America to most of the different parts of the world. I've sort of witnessed, as I discussed and seen firsthand, the Chinese footprint in different parts of the regions. So Sri Lanka's geography, many people discuss about the Sri Lanka's geography. If you look at the ancient maps of Ptolemy, Sri Lanka was clearly depicted, and you can see on your left side the Ptolemy's map, and also the first map of the Hedricus-Matevius map, which is one of the first maps which draws the Cape of Good Hope. Sri Lanka is clearly visible. The elongated the size is perhaps due to the trade relationship Sri Lanka had during the ancient times. On diplomacy, this is a famous painting of Stanley Kirinder, and this shows the basically the emissaries sent from Sri Lanka to Rome in the 1st century. Now, according to the historian Pliny, there were 4 members from Sri Lanka who visited the court of Emperor Claudius Caesar. Another delegation followed to Rome. So basically, this shows the ancient, the diplomatic relationship, and also the island was fully engaged with the rest of the world, even from the ancient time. Yeah. So coming back, basically the geostrategic position of Sri Lanka has been discussed by many scholars. Due to this strategic position of Sri Lanka as a maritime hub, so many governments have been trying to promote as a maritime hub. it doesn't need to promote it as a maritime hub. It is already a geographical, well-situated maritime hub. It is been there, the island from the ancient history and known to the rest of the world. It's sitting on the new Silk Road, the China, the One Belt or the Belt and Road Initiative. So it takes a significant sort of position in the Indian Ocean. Some of the scholars here, Robert Kaplan has clearly mentioned in his book, Monsoon, about Sri Lanka belongs to a new geography. As the triangular power projection is clearly visible in the Indian Ocean, which is India, China, and the US, and Sri Lanka has a significant, is an important place. On John Kerry's report in 2019 to the Senate's Foreign Relations Committee, he urged the US government to forge closer ties with Sri Lanka to prevent it from drifting towards the Chinese sphere of orbit. And also the scholar Harsh Pant clearly mentions as you could see, the importance of Sri Lanka, that China is rapidly catching up, and its ties with Sri Lanka are aimed at expanding its profile in the crucial part of the world. So Indian policymakers realize that unless they are more proactive, they might end up losing this game for good. So this is according to Harsh Pant. And Admiral Harris also speak about the Indian Ocean matters to the US, and Sri Lanka matters to the United States, and the US matters to Sri Lanka. So these are some of the direct comments made by some of the scholars and practitioners. Here is a drawing which I included in my last book, Sri Lanka at Crossroads, where I basically show the importance of Sri Lanka comparing to Japan facing the Pacific, Great Britain facing the Atlantic, Sri Lanka facing the Indian Ocean. The significant position and the geographical marine sphere that surrounds Sri Lanka is of importance, important to Sri Lanka as well as important to the great powers. If you look at the work of Raja Mohan in his Samudra Mantran, Churning of the Ocean, his book, clearly mentions the powers, basically China, they're looking beyond their immediate ocean space. China is already in the Indian Ocean, far from the traditional ocean space, and India has moved beyond the in Malacca choke points and has begun to make naval forays into the Pacific Ocean. So you see powers moving beyond their immediate ocean space, which I clearly agree with Raja Mohan, and this is what we have been seeing. US, for example, is moving much of its assets and tilting its strategy to the Indo-Pacific is clearly visible. For the objective of maritime strategic expansion, it requires allies. Professor Raja Mohan explains that littorals that are strategically located are really, really important. He has a chapter on littorals in his book. And the importance of Sri Lanka to the powers is basically also the other littorals. Is really important. The littorals are important. India joins with Australia and Japan as its close maritime partners to expand its presence in the Pacific Ocean. As you could see, the last months, the India and Japan signed the bilateral logistics, military logistics agreement with Australia. So you could see the expansions going on. BRI, much spoken about, much written by many scholars. One of the places I visited was in Central Asia, in Kazakhstan, where I saw Kazakhstan bordering Soviet Russia, but tremendously influenced right now by China, and a significant infrastructure diplomacy carried out in Kazakhstan. Now, they are building economic corridors, they're building roads. You could see it from your own eyes. You would feel the Chinese presence is almost in all these corridors in Asia, and also in Africa and in Latin America. And according to RAND, the report which came up clearly highlights, I think, totally agree with the analysis here, that the importance of the BRI and also the China's vicinity. If you look at the homeland of China and its vicinity, the periphery is the most important area for China or any other country. But Chinese, when you look at it, the periphery where Nepal is also located is of significant importance to China. And if you look at the entire Asia Pacific, where China has now moved, it's basically power projection, and you could see it in different parts in Sri Lanka clearly, as well as in many other nations. You could see that's three primary attributes. How I assess this, the string of pearls, or what was coined the surrounding India. I refer to the work of Rudolf Schelling, where he mentions for any power, a rising power, you need the spaciousness, the freedom of movement, and internal cohesion. Now, geopolitics scholar Schelling actually clearly identified this back then. And this is what China is clearly looking at. So spaciousness, which China has, it's a massive geography, and its BRI network, which has built the freedom of movement, which is important for China on the marine sphere, as well as on the land. The internal cohesion which China has with its own system is also quite interesting. And the Malacca Trap, which most of the scholars speak about, and most of its trade, where China's trade passes through the narrow straits of Malacca, the world's busiest waterway, which China does not control. Now, building road and rail infrastructure across neighboring states was thus something of a defensive measure to reduce dependence on a single choke point. So the building of the infrastructures, of the Chinese infrastructures, is seen as a defensive measure to reduce dependence. When China announces its aspiration to construct a new Eurasian land bridge in 2003, few took notice, but defense can quickly become offense. Now, this is the idea that Parag Khanna, one of the geopolitical thinkers, put forward, and it is fair to look at it in this perspective. What are the responses to BRI? What are the responses that are equivalent or coming to BRI? BRI is massive, its volume is large, and the projection, power projection, is much higher than any of these. So the responses are the US International Finance and Development Corporation, the EU's Asia Connectivity Initiative, the EU-Japan Partnership of Sustainable Connectivity and Quality Infrastructure, and the US-Japan-Australia, the Blue Dot Network certifications, the India-Japan Connectivity Corridors. So, I mean, if you look at it, the infrastructure has become the battlefield of competitive connectivity among the region. So, the US sphere of influence in Sri Lanka is clearly visible through many if you look at the recent sort of developments. The AXA is the Acquisitions and the Cross-Exchange Agreement, which was signed with Sri Lanka, and it was renewed by the Sirisena government. And SOFA, which is the Status of Forces Agreement, which was discussed during Sirisena's time, and now it's held up by the Gotabaya Rajapaksa's regime, so it's been held up. It's a military logistics agreement. The MCC, which is the Millennium Challenge Corporation, is another on hold by the Rajapaksa regime. The 400+ million US dollars of grant is on hold. The East terminal of the Colombo, the container terminal, a tripartite agreement with Japan, India, and Sri Lanka. That's also under review right now. And US has been sort of promoting democracy in the island, and also human rights agenda, and also the Indo-Pacific. If you look at the latest IPSR, Indo-Pacific Strategy Report, which was released by the last Shangri-la dialogue by Patrick Shanahan, the second most quoted South Asian country is Sri Lanka. And some of the recent statements I sort of picked up from Foreign Minister Wang Yi of China. She says that unilateralism and bullying are forcing their ways in the world, and international disorder is more possible than ever. While the forces for contention remains, as explained by the minister, it's still important to explore possible strategic space to minimize this tension between the US and China. Minister Wang Yi says that this is a political virus. Growing tension is targeting the US presidential elections in November. Hope things would stabilize and in post-election. Now, according to the Indian professor Srikant Kondapudi, he says that Chinese assertive and aggressive responses have been to cover up the COVID-19 disaster. While China's presence in multiple geographies does not reflect that that its actions are intended to cover up the pandemic. I don't see it as it's an intention to cover up the pandemic. It is more that China is playing its famous Weiqi, or equivalent to chess in the West, the Weiqi, and glued to our individual destiny, basically securing our own national interest. So most here I bring in Henry Kissinger's work, he sort of discussing his book World Order, where he rightly refers to an Austrian Foreign Minister, Metternich, where he says that the stable international relations require leaders to acknowledge the true interest of all actors. I see a significant absence that nations are more inward-looking at their own interests, but not on the other countries' interests. It's not promoting its collective interests, basically, or looking at their own selfish national interests, and referring to many of the powers right now. And this is not healthy, and human progress is based on such values of looking at other interests. And now, again, Wang Yi, he mentions mutually beneficial cooperations is essential, and how China and US into a community of shared interests, how China learned from the United States and globalization, how globalization helped many nations, including China, and millions out of poverty. US economy benefited from China. As explained, he said that trade with China helped each American family save $850 every year. Over 70,000 American businesses have made investment in China with a total sales of 700 billion. You can see the intertwined relationship, the strength of that relationship from these statements. And so we advocate a new type of international relations, a win-win situation. Now, 4 decades of this relationship is strained right now. You see the Houston consulate being shut, the Chinese consulate. Then you have the US consulate being shut in China, tit for tat. I think it's time that we look at the long-term horizon and see the benefits for both of the communities, US and China, not on decoupling. US and China could never decouple due to their collective interests and long-term bilateral relations. This is my thinking. 2 views that was discussed, basically, clearly Mersheimer's. It was really interesting to listen to Mersheimer on the NIISSS platform, and where he speaks on the zero-sum game, where China is taking over the role of the United States as a global hegemon. And where Kishore Mahbubani, he speaks of a positive, some more peaceful rise of China, a civilizational context, and other nations accepting China's rise, rather than agitating against the rising power. Now, both scholars referred to George Kennan, clearly basically the view of containment in the Cold War. And when discussing the need for strengthening strategic alliances to contain China, so actually containment, you could see that it has been happening right now, even in the Indian Ocean, periphery, as well as the region. I will discuss that in a bit. Basically, Professor Mahbubani states that America did not win the Cold War on its own. It formed solid alliance with the Western partners in NATO and cultivated their world friends and allies. So it's the importance of allies. And the Trump administration has announced on America First policy and threatened to impose tariffs on key allies like EU, Japan, third world friends like India. Seeing the weak US alliances in the present context, Mersheimer's view is that the next US administration would have to invest more strength, strategic alliance to contain China. So while containment will be at a very high note in this decade, I wouldn't compare this to Cold War, as many scholars have, some of the scholars have spoken earlier on their analysis. It is not a Cold War, as explained by some scholars. The context is different. China is not Soviet Union. It's a strong economy in the world. And now Parag Khanna rightly says that China differs from the Soviet Union in fundamental respects, whereas the Soviet Union was not integrated into the global economy. Now China is more integrated, and it partners with more than 120 countries. It's the largest international creditor. So it is not the same context. While Professor Mahbubani explains in his latest book, Has China Won? says in the Cold War, America's heavy defense expenditure proved as they forced the Soviet Union, a country with a small economy, to match America's military expenses. The context is different with China, and Mr. Wang is rightly explained that we reject any attempt to create so-called the new Cold War. So the brewing tension of U.S.-China is actually affecting nations like Sri Lanka or India or any of the South Asian nations, Pakistan, Nepal, Bangladesh. And today you see militarization going on in the Quad, which is the US, India, Australia, and Japan. Now expanding towards Quad Plus for the COVID-19, but from quadrilateral security arrangements and joint military exercises to signing of military logistics agreements such as India and Australia. What you see is a containment 2.0 at full play, and this is how I sort of assess the situation right now. It was further explained by several Indian scholars the need of a NATO-like military alignment in the Indian Ocean. Now, I see a significant danger in formulating such containment strategies against China, as this would not bring stability to the existing order, but would further destabilize the region and strain the relationship further between the US and China. The Quad coalition features joint strategic patrols and hardware support for the navies of Vietnam, Philippines, Indonesia, and South China Sea. In Sri Lanka, the Hambantota has been discussed many times, and Hambantota lease agreement, the 99-year lease agreement given by the Sirisena Wickremesinghe regime, actually seen as a security threat by many nations on sovereignty and issues. So the infrastructure diplomacy carried out, especially Hambantota strikes out of all of that, and also the port city, which is the largest investment done in Sri Lanka, and inaugurated by President Xi himself and by President Rajapaksa back then in 2014. The Matala airport is another international airport, the Chinese airport, which is built by China, and also there are many other in Sri Lanka. So if you look at the latest statements on the Hambantota, now Hambantota will become the next commercial city in the island with highways, ports, international airports, logistics ready. Now we will make this happen, says Namal Rajapaksa, the eldest son of Mahinda Rajapaksa, and he actually is the representative from Hambantota, a member of parliament, and where he announced a development plan for Hambantota in his election campaign. Now, his long-term view is to continue where his father has left off, converting Hambantota into a modern city under his leadership, perceived as a difficult and unachievable task by many scholars in Colombo. Now, when looking at the massive Chinese infrastructure diplomacy carried out with two global connection hubs, which is the port and the airport, with other ancillary infrastructure, including the international convention centers, cricket stadiums, highways, hotels, and much more to come, this strategy of a next commercial city in the deep south perhaps could be achieved with the Rajapaksa leadership right now, which is Gotabaya Rajapaksa's leadership. I think looking at the rest of the regions, as well as in Central Asia or in Latin America, Africa, what Chinese have done, it is not an unachievable goal. That's what I want to sort of bring to you. The foreign policy, which stems out from the political manifestos of Sri Lanka, if you look at Mahinda Rajapaksa's, which is in 2005, Mahinda Chintana, the vision towards a new Sri Lanka, where he clearly articulated his position as non-aligned in Mind-the-Chintan. Now, when you look at the Gotabaya Rajapaksa's vistas of prosperity, he mentioned balanced, equidistance. Now, you look at you see the evolution going from non-aligned to balance and equidistance. Equidistance was a subject. Now, when I did speak about equidistance sometime back in a discussion forum in India, that Sri Lanka wished to carry out equidistance several years ago, one of the senior scholars of India mentioned that how can you be equidistant, because the distance to India is not the same distance that you have to the rest of the other powers geographically, which is a very interesting comment, and well, equidistant would be a difficult strategy to follow. Balanced, yes, that is possible. But what I see is more of a multi-aligned foreign policy that Sri Lanka is practicing. Sri Lankan Prime Minister, if you look at Mahinda Rajapaksa's 5 decades of political experience, he rightly explains that now we do not wish to get entangled in big power struggles in the region. The regional powers need to focus their energy to promote regionalism, welcome BRI infrastructure development projects transforming and impacting many nations. Now, China cannot be matched with any other nation in its capacity of infrastructure diplomacy. This I have witnessed myself in many countries. India, if you look at the Indian the neighborhood strategy, or neighborhood first policy, the Sagar Mala, which was a great initiative put forward by Prime Minister Modi. I said you should expand it towards Sri Lanka also, the Mala, the Sagar Mala. During this was during his first year of his office, when the Modi Doctrine was written, the book was published. The neighborhood first policy was a great initiative, but when it comes to the actual implementation, it is actually been challenging, and the tension that India has with its neighborhood, with Bangladesh, Nepal, and Pakistan. If you look at so the India needs to get its the neighborhood first policy right, and Sri Lanka could assist in doing that. And if you look at this is the fish hook network and the NCD, National Command Control Communication Intelligence Network, which they have built, and connecting to Japan's fish hook network that's coming, the undersea cable networks that is happening. I mean, a few weeks ago, Prime Minister Modi unveiled the submarine cables to Andaman and Nicobar Islands. So these are seen as significant security threats, and sort of moving towards tension between India and China. And the Chinese submarine presence in Sri Lanka was widely discussed, and during the Rajapaksa's time, and how Delhi was agitated by the presence of the Chinese submarines. So India's concern on its vicinity, on securing its vicinity, as well as the Sri Lankan, it was, I would say, the media overhyped it, the submarine incident, as well as many of if you look at the India, Sri Lanka, the joint military exercise, the Mitra Shakti, which has nothing to do with China, but it was again hyped up by the media outlets saying that India and Sri Lanka are getting together to contain China. And this is from the India newspaper, where the Rajapaksa, blaming the Indian intelligence for his defeat into back then. And so you would see similar patterns, how India's sphere of influence is closely influencing the Sri Lankan domestic politics rather than the other two spheres of China or US. So the India is directly impacting. You look at Sirisena's, towards the end of the presidency, I mean, Sirisena also blamed India. If you look at this report, basically mentions clearly that about the assassination plot, and then about the East container terminal, which he had to give, and therefore that there is a significance. So you would see these patterns not only from one president, but from the previous presidents also, a kind of an unhealthy relationship towards the end. But Gotabaya Rajapaksa has clearly managed to start at a good, I mean, I would say it's a good start, and recalibrate the strong relationship. And the tension is such that you would have to bring in the other sort of, let me go to that. Yeah, they understand the Indian influence in Sri Lanka, or the Tamil Nadu influence to Sri Lankan domestic politics. Now here, I call this the Kaveri sphere of influence, which is stemming from the rich Dravidian, the Kaveri Delta, and its influence from the ancient time to the northern part of Sri Lanka. Now this influence is going to remain for the next 100 years, and it will remain and continue. So if you look at, this is from Professor Rohan Gunratna's book, where he sort of mentioned on the LTT training camps in India, South India, and back then. So the Dravidian or Tamilian influence, and the 200 million who are in Tamil Nadu, and it was clearly visible, and back then, and it's also visible right now. So it's something that the policymakers have to take into account of the certain grievances put forward by the Tamilian people. Now here is the 13th amendment, which was signed, the devolution of power, promising devolution as a solution for the ethnic conflict, as well as the Tamilian, for the Tamilian. And now subsequently the presidents have promised 13 plus to go beyond the devolution. And so you would have to wait and see what's coming out from Gotabaya Rajapaksa regime, from the next constitutional amendment. And one of the pressing issues is the Tamilian factor. And here on the right side is the President Rajapaksa receiving the lessons learned and reconciliation report, the LKIIRSS report, which is long overdue, and as well as a lot to be done in reconciliation of Sri Lanka. And so while the domestic politics is directly influenced by Tamilian, as well as the sphere of influence, so we have to take into account basically the Tamilian grievances also to the central decision-making process. Now, going to the marine sphere, which is very important, for the first time, there was the DMK leader, Mr. Balu, who mentioned that the government need to protect the southern part of the country against China, citing China's huge investments in Sri Lanka. Now, this is the first time that you have China directing towards China. Usually it's about the Tamilian grievances, or but nothing about China. Now China is first time bringing China into the equation, saying that Setu Samudram, which is a canal cutting across the Cork Strait of between India and Sri Lanka, should be continued. And now this is quite interesting. And what I sort of assess this by looking at how the Dr. Shai Jaishankar, the External Affairs Minister, how he sees the Chinese presence in the vicinity as well as the outside. So he says, I quote, the rise of China has impacted the entire world more than other nations. It has impacted its neighbor, India. And China's significant growth is felt and understood by India. The many trilateral, say, Malabar naval exercise could expand to a quadrilateral, bring the Australian Navy now. It's going on right now along with India, US, Japan for the first time. This would push India towards security tension. China is it is already negotiating its northern borders dispute with China. India at the same time will bring Australia to engage in a wider containment strategy in the Indian Ocean. Now the quadrilateral exercise will be seen by China as a thinly disguised strategy of containment. The consequence was rightly assessed by Abhijit Singh, where he says that India should be cautious to such quadrilateral engagement without a cost-benefit exercise and commensurate gains in strategic operational realm. Further, the exercise could be ineffective in the long term. I completely agree with Abhijit on this and should look at the long term. Vital as it is to rules-based order in Asia, the Indian Navy will need to align its priorities with the partner navies, expand its presence in the region. So while the significant growth of militarization is going on in the Indian Ocean, it is directly affected, nations like Sri Lanka are directly affected in the Indian Ocean. Now, Constantino Xavier, he explains that India cannot take promises for granted and should deepen economic interdependence with Sri Lanka, as the island nation will continue to welcome China's enthusiastic, generous, reliable financing for critical infrastructure. And absolutely correct assessment here, because if India does not provide its neighborhood with the infrastructure, the required infrastructure, now even Hambantota was first offered to India. After India declined, it was given to China. If you can't keep up with the infrastructure, so the space is given to China. And soon after the election victory, you see the Chinese embassy, Colombo, the charge d'affaires, who we met with Mahinda Rajapaksa and passed on to congratulate him. And you could see the strong Chinese connection as well as its support to the Rajapaksa regime, and highlighting the Colombo port city to expedite on the work on that. While Rajapaksa's wish is to not get involved in any of this Indo-China, US-China power struggles that is going on, these powers may not leave the Rajapaksas alone. Now, this is my assessment, and although you want to play and sort of not be entangled in any of it, but you will be entangled because of the powers, what they are working on these strategies that they're moving forward. So creating an equilibrium is essential, and preserving the geopolitical equilibrium in Sri Lanka could actively contributing for a rules-based order in the Indian Ocean is essential. Promoting Indian Ocean Zone for Peace, and I bring this from Madam Sirimavu Bandaranaike, play an important role in the endeavor, and thus today we should revisit this declaration due to the geopolitical tensions among the great powers in the Indian Ocean region, which has made the region unstable. Now, less imperial overstretch I would suggest to any of those powers, US or China, especially on imperial overstretch, does not help any of the nations or the regions. It doesn't assist at all. When China did work on most of the countries with the US, with its economic carrying out its economic policies and the trade, I mean, you would see imperial overstretch. So less imperial overstretch is required right now. More buck passing. This is from Mersheimer again. Buck passing, balancing nations is important here, rather than getting entangled in directly confronting or being into the fights with the other or directly confronting. So US uses India and Japan to balance China. So such balancing nations is much more healthy than intervention. Political environment is, if you look at the transparency and sovereignty, is a topic now is being discussed by many nations in South Asia. So more transparent, and what you see is nations moving towards more semi-autocratic regimes, unfortunately, and bringing in, as Professor Razin Salih mentions, Malayan mercantilism coming in because of the certain the positions taken by or policy decisions taken. So the balance in the triple sphere of influence and the triple security challenges. The triple sphere is the US, China, India. The triple security challenges, how I basically see is that the extremist terrorism threat in the region, and which affected Sri Lanka significantly. The largest terrorist attack in 2019 took place. This is a serious security threat. The Elam ideology, which is already there, there was recent cyber hacks to many of the critical, some of the infrastructures. It is already there. So there's no solution coming in from the region, or there's no solution with the diaspora engagement strategy. So you would see the security threat coming in from there. And the external geopolitical issues from Sri Lankan foreign policy of if you don't balance or make an effort to actually balance the foreign policy. The four challenges to the Rajapaksa regime that I clearly sort of identify is preserving democracy is number one, because you have siblings, one's executive running the executive arm, the other sibling running the legislature as the prime minister. So separation of powers will be important, and checks and balances. So the constitution reform that's coming up on the 20th amendment will be a very important juncture, I would say, and a challenge. An economic condition, as you know, Sri Lanka is the lowest growth rates, below 3% in the region. So it needs focus its energy on basically getting the fighting against the global recession and overcoming and creating a better economic condition in this challenging time. UN Human Rights Council, as well as the reconciliation, is an important element. I would say working on amendments rather than withdrawing would be a better way forward, and reconciliation and diaspora re-engagement as the Tamilian diaspora re-engagement strategy. And finally, the equidistance or the balanced foreign policy is the most important. And I thank you very much.
Thank you, Asang. Thank you very much for the interesting and comprehensive presentation. You have touched upon all the major issues and major powers, Sri Lanka, US, and the issue of MCC, Sri Lanka, China, and BRI, Sri Lanka, India, and the issues of Hambantota and many others. We have got lots of questions which revolves around similar issues. So without wasting much time, let me get to the questions and answers round. The first question is, the SLPP won the national election with a nearly almost majority. How would it reflect on India, Sri Lanka relations and collaborations. So that is first. How would you like to go, one by one, or maybe we can bring 3-4 questions?
Yeah, maybe have like 3 questions.
Yes. And second question is that how can Sri Lanka and other small states in Indo-Pacific region successfully balance relations between the US and China? Will Rajapaksa presidency lead to make independent foreign policy of Sri Lanka? How can India counter so-called strings of pearls strategy of China? And third question also in similar lines, there are lots of interest of US, China, and India regarding the Indian Ocean. How Sri Lanka managed to maintain peaceful relations and progress economically and politically in new era of great powers. Maybe you can respond.
I think I've covered the 3 questions in my presentation. If you look back, I will share my slides with you all. SLPP victory, I was projecting this 2 months ago, coming in as a significant majority due to the absence of the opposition. The opposition was split into 2. The UNP, which is a 7-decade party, historical party, it was split and it won only 1 seat. I compared actually a few months ago to Bangladesh, looking at the elections in Bangladesh, where 3 out of 300 seats, 258 was won by the government party. And similarly, 145 was won by 225 seats. So it's a significant victory, but it comes with greater responsibility on basically checks and balances mainly, as well as it's a majoritarian government, so it has to sort of protect democracy and also power sharing between the executive and the legislature. So one of the most important areas that I've sort of highlighted is preserving, and there were few, I mean, before even the Prime Minister was appointed, there was a few media outlets who mentioned the sibling rivalry as well as loss of democracy. And so this you would have to see how they practice rather than you come to assumptions that there is going to be a sibling rivalry or there is going to be there's democracy. So you would have to see from their practice. India, Sri Lanka relations is strong. I mean, it is. It goes back to the ancient days, and it is. As Lakshman Kadir mentioned, it is lost in the mist of ancient history. The relationship is this is the closest sphere of influence that I've mentioned. So we need to build that relationship further. I think the strong the mandate and what Rajapaksa has clearly mentioned, that it will not get involved in power struggles, gives a clear sort of a message that would sort of create an equal and balanced foreign policy. And so I think the version, the 2005 to 2015, where Rajapaksa, the next version of that, Mahinda Chinta, that's why I mentioned, would continue. The same relationship would continue, but we learned from many challenges that even that relationship had. So there will be, I hope it will be a positive relationship. And on the second question, I think that I have covered on my the presentation on the US-China, basically the power struggle and how it impacts, and the string of pearls. India does not need to worry that on the submarines, for example, the visits of the submarines. First, it was number one, it was hyped up saying it was nuclear submarines. It was not nuclear, it was conventional. Then they mentioned there was in the media that India did not know about it. India was informed of this position. So our foreign foreign policy, um, um, once were engaged within the ministries of foreign affairs, did not sort of play it was not a knee-jerk reaction that a submarine appeared, and they had to sort of it was carefully looked at, and there's not need to fear. So there is a fear of Chinese presence in Hambantota. Now, Hambantota is not Djibouti, clearly, and this you'd have to understand. One needs to visit Djibouti, and none needs to visit Hambantota. It belongs to the Sri Lankan jurisdiction. It belongs to our nation. It's been leased out, but it doesn't mean it is militarized or it is being used for military purpose. I think, did I cover most of it? Or
yes.
Yeah. On the last, could you repeat the last question?
Like there are lots of interest of US, China, India regarding the Indian Ocean. So how Sri Lanka managed to maintain peaceful relation and progress economically and politically in that geopolitical rivalry?
Well, we tend to follow a balanced foreign policy. That's why I mentioned the importance of Indian Ocean Zone for peace. Nations like Sri Lanka, with limited resources, the geography that it has, although it is a significant strategic position in the Indian Ocean, we do not have the muscle to sort of to play with the great powers. So what we could do is promote peace and harmony in the region, a rules-based order. There is an interesting piece written by Abhijit Singh on RBO, rules-based order, and what littorals can do. What we should promote is that's Indian Ocean Zone for peace, where less rivalry and more on economic development. We have lost, if you look at the South Asia, it is a very rich place with much resources, human capital. But we have got into this power struggles. We have lost decades, I would say. Most leaders get carried, some of the leaders get carried away with one power and antagonize or threaten the other country, the neighboring country. So we have lost economically, and I think it's time that Asia should gain, and we should be focused on bringing back Asia as one developed place, so especially South Asia, and get maximum out of the Indian Ocean.
Let's move to second round of question. How will Sri Lanka balance between US Indo-Pacific strategy and China's BRI? What is Sri Lanka's stand on MCC, Millennium Challenge Corporation? Second question is, Nepal is between India and China. Bangladesh and Sri Lanka only borders with India, either through land or maritime. Why does India often accuse Nepal, Bangladesh, or Sri Lanka getting closer to India? Does small neighbors want to bring China to counterbalance India's influence? And third question is, many countries often take Sri Lanka as an example of China trapping Sri Lanka on a debt trap. What fraction is China's debt compared to total Sri Lankan foreign debt?
On the Indo-Pacific and BRI, in the Pacific, as I mentioned, that it was the second highest reference country, Sri Lanka. The BRI, how do you balance? I think the Indo-Pacific is a strategy put forward, starting from the Look East to the Asia Pacific, then becomes the Pacific. So we are working. We need to sort of balance Sri Lanka as a nation. The both strategies. So bringing in, benefiting from both is the way forward for a country like Sri Lanka, not taking sides in here. BRI is an infrastructure development project. What you see is that, and the Indo-Pacific also could give support. On the MCC, now Millennium Challenge Corporation is a grant fund. Now the assessment was done by a presidential commission in Sri Lanka. And so it clearly sort of it's been held up by the Sri Lankan government, and it will be taken up, I believe, by the new cabinet. How I see this is basically Sri Lanka should work with the MCC also by amending if there's anything of severe to the national security threat or threatening the national security of the country. Now, on page 11 of the Presidential Commission, it's clearly mentioned on a footnote saying that there was an assessment done by the previous think tank, which is the Institute of National Security Studies, which I was heading, done. So that assessment gives a sort of a neutral and a balanced position, saying that here are some of the areas that needs to be amended in the MCC, such as the LPRG, Land Policy Research Group. This is one clause I'm mentioning. LPRG is a land policy research group that will be formulated in Sri Lanka to take policy decisions on land matters. Now, that we cannot have in Sri Lanka because the policy decisions will be taken by the ministries of Sri Lanka. So certain things need to be clarified, need to be amended, need to be, so once you do that, I think US is ready to listen as well as amend and move forward. So there is no such thing as hard and parcel. These are not things that put down the throat that you have to sort of take it. So amendment and moving forward is important, and nations like Sri Lanka should do that. On the debt trap, predatory loans, debt trap, this is, I would say it's more amplified in the Western media. When I was in the US, in DC, as well as in a few other places when I was teaching there, so there it was amplified, saying that, look, we are under serious, significant Chinese sphere of influence. We have been controlled. Sri Lankan economy is controlled by China. No, it's not. That's not the case. And if you look at the total debt of Sri Lanka, it's much more. Our sovereign debts are much more higher than the Chinese borrowings, and this is clearly mentioned by a few of our think tanks in Colombo working on the economic area. So basically, you could read from those reports. So they have been quantified and been projected, and so this is there is no control. The Chinese is controlling the economy as such. But China is making a significant the trade with South Asian countries. If you look at the one of the latest Brookings reports on the region and its trade, if you look, the Chinese trade is much more than India does with its neighboring countries. So the significant. I mean, India was the largest trading partner in Sri Lanka back then, but not anymore. So it's China who's the largest trading partner. So China is actually doing things, building the infrastructure, while India is not. I mean, India is in that sort of not in that sort of scale, as in not in that sort of volume, and so this has to be clearly understood. And is that it, Pramod? Is there more question?
Yes, there was also a question like, why do India often blame small neighbors? India, like Nepal, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka.
I think the geography matters first. The size of the geography. India is a huge civilization. I mean, if you look at it, it's multiple ethnic dimensions. It's I think the size of India. So I think there is a tendency. I mean, that's why I mentioned about the Kaveri Delta effect. Sri Lanka has a direct effect to the Tamil the matter, and it will not go off the agenda, even if the governments or the subsequent governments try to take it off. It will be there. The devolution will be there. You cannot take it off the agenda. because the sphere of influence of the Kaveri Delta is there. So like that in Nepal, in Bangladesh, and you see there has been some points in the history, I would say a strained relationship between India. India needs to, I think, get off the Monroe Doctrine. There's mentality, which I think Prime Minister Nehru was also practicing some time back. The vicinity should not have any other powers, but only India. Now this is where the primary problem is, and if you look at China, its development in many of the neighboring countries, that's something that the neighboring countries are benefiting. So if India actually can focus on its neighborhood first policy and increase the aid as well as on the infrastructure, equaling to China, or as if you look at it, in terms of capacity. So I think there is much more, and that India could sort of give to the neighboring countries. And India should think always. I mean, it thinks as a rising power, but India is a great power in the region, and should think as a great power in the region, and should assist the neighboring countries. Because if you can't assist the neighboring countries, how are you going to sort of align or assist or align with the other countries? You need to have trust with built with the neighboring countries. It is true that China is building the infrastructure, but if you look at culturally, we are more closer to India, and that's something that all of us have. And so it's rather than antagonizing or working on certain, I would say there have been instances in Sri Lankan history also. So it's time that we learn from the past as well as move forward. And so neighborhood first policy, as well as working towards more on infrastructure, would help India.
Let's move to the last round of questions because we are running out of time. India often claims that Hambantota port has a strategic implication on India. If it is so, why did India not finance the port? Because you just mentioned that Sri Lanka initially asked India to build it. How do you look at it? Second is, would there be any change in India's position with the change in regime in Sri Lanka at the moment? Third, is China influencing the present Sri Lankan government to stop getting aid or grant from Japan or USA? For example, Colombo LRT was to be funded by JICA, but it is now at hold. MCC from US seems to be facing similar situation. So this is the last question for today.
Oh, well, the Hambantota was initially given to India, and India didn't want to pursue that, and so we went to China. And the government of Sri Lanka has clearly mentioned that they will not militarize this support, and because of the strategic position, India has a worry that would Hambantota be militarized, or I mean, it's the same worry that they would have on Guada or Kouappo, Myanmar. So it is, I mean, India's vicinity that you have this strategic port, but doesn't, the government of Sri Lanka has clearly mentioned that we will not use it for military purpose or anything. But here the problem is that some of the thinkers, like the Japanese scholars, one has mentioned that what if Sri Lanka dependency on China increases more, and that Sri Lanka would be sort of forced to give to China. Now that sort of discussion is there, but I don't see that we would ever antagonize India and give this port to China for military purpose. I don't see it. And on the next question on which was the other one?
Like with the change of regime, like will there be
the regime change? No, it wouldn't. I mean, Sirisena Wickremesinghe, well, it started. I mean, the previous regime started with a pledge that they would investigate on the Chinese projects, and they would, but nothing happened, and it didn't happen. So the governments do try. I mean, with the election manifestos to come into power, promising many things. But would there be the difference in the relationship with China? No, I don't see the strong relationship. It's been established by the Rajapaksas, especially when President Xi visited in 2014. That would continue. That relationship was much more stronger, and it was built on a lot of trust. So that would continue, as well as the relationships with India, which was a bit strainful during the last years of the Rajapaksa. Now Gotabaya has re-looked at it and will be recalibrated. And yeah, so there will be a change, of course, from the Wickremesinghe's more towards the tilt towards West, as well as so there'll be more on the question is whether Rajapaksas will tilt towards China. So I think that would be, this time would be a balanced approach would be taken by the Rajapaksas. What's the final question that you?
One was like, I think you mentioned at the first, like Japanese project or American project are not doing well. So is there China's interference in that? And the first was how strategic implication and first went to India.
Yeah, the container terminal as well as the Japanese, the monorails, that's project. No, that has nothing to do with China, and China is not doing anything to harm the all working towards the Japanese. I mean, there's no what some of the media outlets are projecting some completely negative as well as I would say misinformation on that. There is no China is not doing any harm to any of these. It's decisions made by those governments as well as the projects. So the Japanese monorail was from them. So there's nothing to do with China. The decision on the East Container Terminal was taken by the government and to relook at it. So it will be relooked at. So it is nothing to do with China. And China is not, so moment you lose the footprint of some of the Western projects or the MCC, that doesn't mean that China is taking a total grip on the Sri Lankan infrastructure. So that it has no connection there.
Thank you, Asanga. It was really interesting discussion. We learned a lot. I, on behalf of NICE, would like to thank you for your time. We'd love to have you again in future on some other regional or bilateral issues. Thank you very much for your time. We'd also like to thank our participants for their questions and time. Thank you very much. Have a nice day.